In the back doorway of Lum Thong's Lotus Garden, Chuck, born Ji Wang, pulled hard on a lucky strike and sent smoke into the still air. He stood in the same spot to smoke at least 7 times a day, and he had for over 10 years. By now, he had the dull surroundings memorized. The Straw Virgin Clothier parking garage across the street, the backyard on the other side of the listing fence full of rusting bicycle parts and mangled wire chicken coops, the Esso station at the corner with a rock hole and the rotating red, white, and blue sign. When he gazed at these things, as at all other times of the day, Chuck imagined his wife, May, watching him. He didn't know the mechanics of how she might see him, but she was so strongly with him, though she was still in Hong Kong, that he knew that she could see what he saw, and to her it would be foreign and colorful. So it was to him when he used her eyes. Cars accelerated after the light changed at the corner, racing up York Road the half-mile to the next light, which was poorly timed on purpose to discourage speeding. The 336 pulled into Rydal Station, just out of sight on the other side of the hill. Chuck knew exactly when to expect the train's whistle and rattle. After all, he was in the same spot at the same time every day, after the lunch rush, after prepping for dinner, before fixing the staff meal. If people got off the train, they would make their way up the hill toward Lum Thong's Lotus Garden. They would get in waiting cars or walk quickly in the other direction, down Castle Street or Bader Road, to the neighborhoods that were home to the men who wore suits and hats and worked in the city and brought their families, occasionally, to Lum Thong's Lotus Garden. Chuck did not live in his neighborhood. His house, not a house really, but a room on the 3rd floor of his employer's home, was a bus and a trolley ride away. The sun hadn't appeared in more than 2 weeks, forcing the gray sky close to the ground. The air was hot and wet. It surrounded Chuck, and without moving from his spot, he sweated even more than he did standing in the infernal kitchen. He took the dish towel from his shoulder and patted his forehead. He wiped his neck to emphasize for May his discomfort. When he stubbed his cigarette with the toe of his tennis shoe, he saw a girl walk past the gas station, cross the street, and head up the block toward the restaurant. From a distance, he couldn't tell if she was a child or older. He squinted to see her as she approached. She wore a short red skirt that showed sturdy legs. That was the first thing he noticed. And also, he saw that her long hair fell over her eyes. She put it behind her ears and it fell forward again. He couldn't stop looking. She tripped on the broken pavement and then caught herself before falling. She looked at Chuck, clearly embarrassed that he had witnessed her awkwardness. He expected her to keep walking up York Road to the Woolworths or the magazine store or to cross the shop of the Straw Virgin Clothier, but she veered off the sidewalk, traversed the parking lot, and walked right up to him. Is this your place? She needed to clear her throat, as though she may have just spoken her first words of the day. She wore a white shirt, unbuttoned partway, revealing a glistening layer of sweat on her neck and exposed chest. She was not a child. No, Lum Thong. He pointed to the sign on top of the building, red block letters in English with smaller Chinese characters underneath. The exact interpretation of those letters was, place of good food. The Chinese on the sign was silly to Chuck. Few Chinese people ate at Lum Thong's. Few Chinese people lived in this neighborhood. His employer did not ask his opinion. You're hiring? There was a help wanted sign in the window, so she already knew the answer. Maybe she wanted Chuck's reassurance that she might be hired as a young girl, as a white girl. He took another look at her, not a line on her face and no smile. Of age, he thought, but very young. Maybe the same age as his second son. Go inside, asked Ben. The kind thing would have been to tell her not to bother. Ben barely trusted the nieces and second cousins that he hired. He wouldn't trust this young white girl. She was almost blonde, like Patty Duke on television, like some of the girls who came in wearing school uniforms, laughing loud and paying for lunch with their own money. When she passed him to walk toward the restaurant door, he caught a fragrance that he knew from American women on the bus, spicy and promising, sweeter on this girl than others. He turned to watch her. She was very pleasing from behind. It was a view he could appreciate often. She opened the door and was gone from sight. He trusted that May was busy with something and did not witness him with the girl. He planned to fix snow pea pork for the staff meal. It took 5 minutes. He had time for another smoke. Ben, born Lum Thong, hired the girl. Her name was Hannah. Chuck watched through the eye-level glass of the kitchen door and saw Ben talking to her. She nodded her head, but no American ever understood Ben. Chuck's food was good, otherwise there would have been no business at Lum Fong's, because Ben hated when Americans didn't understand him. And he let them know it, forcing a customer to leave for saying "what" too many times when Ben rattled on in his version of English. Before opening in the morning, Chuck and the dishwasher, Yuan, would sit at the back table folding wontons. They would laugh as they heard Ben try to order from the food supply company. He started out in a normal voice, and then yelled when they wouldn't understand him, often hanging up the phone without placing an order. Chuck spoke better English than Ben, though he hadn't been here as long. But Ben did not ask him for help, and Chuck did not offer. The next morning, when Hannah arrived for her first day of work, she wasn't sweating. Maybe she took a bus. Maybe she was driven to work. Again, she wore a white shirt, and this time a bright yellow skirt. Chuck was pleased that she was not a pants wearer, as so many girls her age were. He showed Hannah how to fold the wonton wrapper over the ground pork mixture. Chuck could fold 12 in a minute using his chopstick. Hannah had to use her fingers and was very slow. Chuck got her a bowl of water so she could wet her fingers when they became gummy from the fat pork. She concentrated hard and didn't look up from her work. "You wait tables before?" Chuck asked, breaking a long silence. She continued folding, poorly, and said, "No, not really." At 10 o'clock, Chuck got up. "You smoke?" Hannah jumped out of her seat and wiped her hands on the apron around her waist. They stood together just outside the back door. The garbage hadn't been picked up yet, and the smell of food rotting was strong, but they quickly masked it with their smoke. Sunshine tried to break through the low ceiling, causing them both to squint, but providing no real brightness to the day. Hannah looked off down the street, toward the Esso station and beyond. Chuck observed her out of the corner of his eye. He willed May to go tend to the youngest, the one that was born just before Chuck left Hong Kong, who was now old enough to not need tending, but still, he wished May would leave him alone at this minute. Hannah seemed to be comfortable smoking in silence. Chuck was not. There was something he wanted to say, but didn't know what, and did not know how to speak to a young American girl. "Student?" "No, no money." She didn't look at him. Maybe she was ashamed of being poor. That he could understand. She swept hair off her face only to let it fall again. It covered one eye. Ben would never let her wait tables or shell peas, for that matter, with hair in her face, even though there was something very pretty about the way she constantly hid her face and then revealed it. Hid it and revealed it. Hannah finished folding the wontons on her own while Chuck did his final prep in the kitchen, chopping scallions and straining broth. When Hannah brought the bowl of filled wontons into the kitchen, he reached in his pocket and handed her a rubber band, gesturing toward her head. She wiped her hands on her apron and pulled her hair up and wrapped the rubber band around it. Chuck looked away. He did not like anyone touching hair in his kitchen, even when the touching revealed a lovely pale neck. Ben pushed on the kitchen door and nodded for Hannah to follow him into the seating area. Just before the lunch rush would begin, Chuck came out of the kitchen to check on her. She stood at the cash register studying the menu. "You like Chinese food?" "I've never had it," she said, not taking her eyes off the menu. "Well, I've had an egg roll. It's okay, but I've never had the wet stuff." The 8 tables and 10 booths of Lum Fong's Lotus Garden filled quickly, as they always did on Fridays. Chuck watched from the kitchen. He saw her take 2 sodas to 2 tables, and after a few minutes she came in with an order. Chuck told her to shout it out and place the order ticket in sequence on the wire rack. He saw that he would have trouble reading her writing, but now was not the time to advise her. Hannah caught on to order taking, but was unfamiliar with the food. She delivered the right orders to the table, but didn't know who got which dish. Chuck could see that Ben did not offer help. He stayed at the cash register and kept a close eye on Hannah as she moved from one table to the next, into the kitchen and back. Customers seemed to be okay with sorting their food out themselves. This is what she told Chuck when they stood outside after the lunch rush. It was overcast once again, threatening as a thunderstorm. She pulled money out of her apron pocket and began counting, leaving a cigarette dangling from her mouth, letting the smoke drift up to her face, causing her left eye to flutter. Chuck did not like seeing her this way. She looked tough. What would May be thinking? $12 and change, she said. This didn't seem to please or displease her. She stuck her left hand in her apron pocket and began jingling the change. Chuck thought he would fix something special for staff meal. Shrimp with lobster sauce. Ben went to the bank on Friday afternoons and then stopped at Dandy's Tavern on West Avenue. He wouldn't come back until just before dinner rush. If Chuck left one shrimp out of each customer order of shrimp chow mein, Ben would never know that Chuck had served staff the best dish on the menu. When Chuck put the bowl of shrimp and the bowl of rice on the back table, Yuan immediately reached for it and said in Chinese that they better eat fast before Ben came back and saw what Chuck had served. Yuan filled his bowl with rice and covered it with the steaming shrimp. Hannah stared at it. Chuck stood next to her, waiting for her to fill her bowl. Yuan held his bowl close to his face and brought the food into his mouth quickly with the chopsticks. Chuck brought Hannah a fork. She put a small amount of shrimp in her bowl and brought a single shrimp to her mouth, putting a tiny portion between her teeth. "Hot," she said, fanning her hand in front of her mouth. Chuck wanted May to see how delicious his American Chinese cooking was, how this quiet girl appreciated it. He stood behind Hannah, waiting for her to try again. She did. She bit and chewed and swallowed, and then nodded her head and spooned shrimp and sauce into her bowl until it was full. Chuck sat down and filled his own bowl. He watched her eat while he finished his meal. It was delicious. The shrimp were tender without being limp. The sauce let all of the flavors through: the fish stock, the garlic, the scallions, the bits of red pepper, the peas and water chestnuts. The consistency was perfect, thick but not gluey, all of it cooked just to doneness and not beyond. Chuck noticed Hannah's hand trembled as she brought food to her mouth. Still, she did not speak at all during their meal. Though it was Hannah's job, Chuck cleared the staff table after they ate. He would tell her about this duty tomorrow. The dinner rush started right at 5:45. Chuck knew that Ben would stand at the register with his hands folded and watch Hannah, waiting for her to make a mistake so grievous he could fire her and tell himself he was right not to trust an American girl. Chuck tried to keep an eye on her. "She won't last," Yuan said, bringing in a tub of dirty dishes. "She doesn't smile." "Why should she smile? Maybe your life is sad. Besides, she's concentrating." By 7:45, the order bar had only one ticket left on it. Unlike downtown, where the Chinese restaurants stayed open until 10 or 11, in this suburb, dinner was over early on Friday night so that diners could get on with their weekends. Chuck looked at the ticket. He could fix mugu gai pan in his sleep. He threw ingredients in the wok while Hannah watched. He thought he could smell her perfume over the smell of the celery and onions and chicken cooking. He put a dome of rice on the plate and slid the mugu gai pan next to it. He watched as Hannah took it to the table of the gray-haired man who ate by himself almost every night. Chuck could see the man smile at Hannah. He could not see if Hannah smiled back. She wiped down the tables. As she leaned over to clean the farthest point of the booth tables, her heels lifted out of her worn loafers and her calves flexed, revealing muscles that could not become so complex without some effort. Maybe she was an orphan with a life of manual labor, or a vagabond forced to walk great distances to find work. The next day, after he checked in the order from the food company and cut the chicken into pieces and sliced the spare ribs and butterflied the shrimp, he went to stand outside earlier than usual. He smoked 2 cigarettes before he saw her walking up the hill. She wore a light blue skirt, and he watched as she came into closer focus, her compact figure moving through the dense air. He turned before she would see him staring and lit a 3rd cigarette, which would last him until she reached the spot where he was standing. The dog growled in the cluttered yard over the fence as Hannah approached. Her hair was pulled back. Chuck was relieved, though he noticed strands which she had not captured with a rubber band. He said hello, formally, as May would want him to. He did not offer her a cigarette, but he put his own out and followed her in through the back of the restaurant. Ben was not yet in. Chuck was always the first to arrive, followed by Yuan. So Chuck told Hannah about filling the soy sauce containers and setting the tables and preparing the tea. She asked no questions and did everything as told. When Ben arrived, he would have no cause to complain. She sat with Chuck and Yuan at the back table. She took the string off Snow Peas while Chuck and Yuan folded wontons. Yuan talked nonstop, but Chuck barely listened and was annoyed at the rudeness to Hannah to speak in a language she could not understand, though she did not seem to care. She tilted her head to one side, watching her hands as they pulled the string from each snow pea, appearing to be deep in thought. Without his asking, Hannah followed Chuck outside for a cigarette. It was hazy and hot. When the traffic was stopped at the light, they could hear insects buzzing in the dry grass next door. Their noise was so angry that it seemed the heat was radiating from the insects, not from the gray sky and scorching asphalt. As they smoked, Chuck thought about what he might say, but nothing came to him. May was no help. Her face broad and stony, always watching Chuck, but now also watching the girl. When Hannah was about to take her last puff, Chuck said, "My wife stayed behind." And as soon as he said it, he realized she would not know what he meant because he had been speaking to her in his head, and only part of what he was saying came out. "Oh," she said, and turned to walk in the back doorway. Ben had arrived and called Hannah over to the cash register. Chuck tasted the soup stock and tossed in some white pepper, then looked out the kitchen door window to see Hannah on the phone with Ben standing behind her. Chuck opened the door. 6 lobsters, 6-pound shrimp, 8 ducks. She was reading off the food purveyor's order sheet. Ben stood behind her. "Monday. Say Monday." "Monday," she said. "I think he wants it Monday." Ben nodded. He would keep the quiet American girl. Chuck smiled, and when he did, he felt May's disapproval. When May was with him on the bus ride back to his room in Ben's house in the evening, he felt her admiration. He liked for her to see his tired fellow passengers, black women in maids' uniforms, men from the steel factory carrying lunch pails, sometimes an old person sleeping. Then May could see his sacrifice, his bravery, his skilled navigation of this strange country. He liked for her to see him cook. It was so easy for him. On busy days, he could put out 150 meals by himself. Many other Chinese restaurants their size had assistant cooks, but Chuck did not need an assistant. He worked swiftly, the kitchen set up so that everything was within his reach, and he thought May might regard his movements as a dance. Saturday was always busy, lunch and dinner. Hannah had to push tables together for a party of 6 and a party of 8. Ben took drinks to the table, but didn't help her any more than that. When she brought the ticket in for the table of 8, she did not call out the dishes. There was perspiration on her upper lip and her temples, and her white shirt looked damp. She did not complain, and Chuck thought that she was very strong, like May. Though if they were together, he would assure May there was no comparison. She brought in the last ticket and stuck it on the wire. "Spare ribs and more wonton," she said quietly. The waitress was supposed to dish up the soup herself. He would teach her that soon, but now he gave her a plate of the spare ribs and ladled soup into a bowl with just the right amount of meat, wontons, and vegetables. Tomorrow he would tell her about the soup and about clearing the staff meal and wiping down the chairs and attaching the soda canisters. And before she left tonight, he would tell her that what he meant to say was that he had a wife, but that she was with him. He had not truly left her behind, though that was not quite it either. Hannah turned to take the food to the last table, and Chuck saw that a red stain spread out on the back of her light blue skirt. "Han," he said. He had not spoken her name yet. He left the stove and put a hand on her shoulder to stop her from going through the door. He pointed to the back of her skirt. She turned her head to look, and Chuck noticed flushing on her neck and her soft cheeks. May was shaking her head, though Chuck didn't know if it was because he had done the right thing or the wrong thing. Hannah did not seem to know which way to go. She put the dishes she was holding on the counter. She left the kitchen. Chuck saw her go to the payphone by the restrooms. He took the spare ribs and the soup out to the last diners. When he turned around, Hannah was not in the front of the house. Had she walked home? Chuck went out the back door, pulling a cigarette from his pocket. Hannah stood away from the light of the back door smoking. In the distance beyond the train station, jags of lightning lit up the darkening sky every few seconds. It was thrilling to see the world illuminated in such a spectacular way, and Chuck was glad to be sharing this with Hannah. Before Chuck finished his cigarette, before he could say what he wanted to say, a car pulled into the parking lot. A bright red convertible, a Cadillac, Chuck saw. It was so new that it didn't yet have plates. The top was down, and Chuck saw a couple. A man with gray hair and a woman with light hair, lighter than Hannah. Before the car came to a stop, the woman opened the door, and Hannah squeezed behind her into the back seat. For the first time, Hannah looked Chuck in the eyes. She held her hand up in a small goodbye as the convertible top lifted and covered the passengers. Immediately, heavy drops of rain fell, soaking Chuck in an instant. It was no surprise to Ben or Yuan that Hannah did not return the next day. The help-wanted sign went back in the window, but Ben would surely hire a cousin's daughter home from college for the summer since Hannah didn't work out and really no one expected her to. Cars flew by Lum Fong's Lotus Garden, not as many today. It was Sunday. The insects buzzed rhythmically as though they were breathing. Chuck did not expect to see Hannah in the distance walking toward him, but he looked to the corner as he smoked. May he had not seen in person in 10 years. But over Chuck's shoulder, observing the American world with her husband, May was sharper, sturdier, and lovelier than Hannah, and she always would be.